So now we're going to talk about pipeline hazards. So we spent a lot of time talking about pipelines, and now we're going to talk about some of the problems we run into and how we fix them. So the contents for today, I'm going to start out with an introduction to hazards, and we're going to use the register file as an example for this. We're going to talk about how we solve the register file problem by sort of cheating. We're going to fix the register file. Then we're going to talk about data hazards in more general, and two ways to deal with them. One of these is stalling, where we just sort of wait for the hazard to resolve itself, and the other is forwarding, where we send the data around through new paths in the processor in order to avoid the hazard. We're then going to talk about control hazards, and that is how do hazards show up with branches, and the branch delay slot that's the result of this in MIPS. We're going to talk some about structural hazards and how those are solved in the pipeline that we've already seen. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the performance impact of hazards. And this is where we're going to get back to all the times I mentioned in the last lecture about how pipelines are great if you can keep the pipeline full. And we'll see some of the reasons why it's hard to keep the pipeline full. So, what's not in this lecture? Well, there's a lot of detailed discussion in the book about how hazards are detected. You should make sure you take a look at this because you need to be able to look at code and figure out the hazards. So let's go ahead and get started with an introduction to hazards, and we're going to look at the register file. So where were we with pipelining from the previous lecture? Well, we'd seen some good news. So we saw that with pipelining, we can have multiple instructions in parallel in the pipeline. Each one is isolated by latches, and this is great. It means that if we have an n-stage pipeline, we can get an n times speed up. So a lot better performance by using pipelining. There's also some bad news about pipelining, and that is that the instructions interfere with each other. So these are called conflicts or hazards, and that's what this lecture is going to talk about. Why do they interfere with each other? Well, different instructions may need the same resource. This is called a structural hazard. So if they both need to access the same part of the processor at the same time. Different instructions may need results from other instructions. This is a data hazard, where the data that the instruction needs isn't ready on time. And different instructions may also need to do different execution depending on others. So this is branch instructions or control hazards. So we're going to look at these three different types of hazards during this lecture. So let's take a look at what the good part about pipelining we had from the previous lecture. So we execute one instruction, and it's going to do 5 different things in the 5 stages of the pipeline. And then the next instruction is going to overlap. The instruction after that is going to overlap. So because of pipelining, we can overlap these instructions. So here in cycle 4, we have 3 instructions that are doing the same thing. The first instruction is accessing the data memory in the memory stage. The second instruction is accessing the ALU in the execute stage. And the third instruction is accessing the register file in the instruction decode stage. So we get better usage of our processor by pipelining and overlapping instructions. So now let's talk about the interference, or the bad parts of pipelining. So let's walk through another program. So here we've got an add instruction, and in the first clock cycle it's going to start with the instruction memory, accessing the instruction. We've got another add instruction. So this one's going to start in the second clock cycle. Now we've got 2 instructions running in the same clock cycle, a third one, a fourth one, and when we get to the 5th clock cycle and we've got a 5th instruction running, we now have a problem. So the 1st and 4th instructions are now going to interfere with each other through the register file. Let's take a look at why that is. So the first instruction here is writing to the register file. At the same time, the 4th instruction wants to read from the register file. So this is interference. We have 2 instructions that are both trying to use the same resource in the pipeline. And we need to figure out how to fix this, or we're not going to get the right result. We only have 1 register file, so how do we have 2 instructions use that register file? We need to fix this before we can go on and run the rest of the pipeline. So let's take a look at this in more detail. The problem we have is that both instructions want the same resource. One of them wants to write it, and the other one wants to read it. And the problem is we only have 1 register file. 2 instructions that want to use it, 1 register file. So how can we fix this? Well, one reasonable way to fix this would be to delay the reading instruction. So if we take that reading instruction and we get rid of it from here and move it down a little bit later, now we don't have any problem. But this is going to be bad for performance. So we've just delayed that instruction. Now we've got all these bubbles going through our pipeline that aren't doing any work. And indeed, if you look at what's happening here, this read instruction is now going to interfere with the instruction after the first instruction. So if we want to take care of this problem by delaying, we're going to have to put in an awful lot of these empty bubble instructions in order to make sure we don't have any interference. So that will really hurt our performance. We could also try never writing conflicting instructions. So this is not great because we have a register-to-register architecture, and if we limit which instructions we can use, we're going to get bad performance. Or we could cheat. So there's another solution to this, which is actually by changing the register file. So the problem we have is we want to read and write at the same time. What we can do is we can build a double-pumped register file. This is a register file that writes on the first half of the clock cycle and reads in the second half. It's double pumped in that it does two things in one clock cycle. Here's a picture with our double pumped register file. You can see the first half is where we do our writes, and the second half is where we do our reads. Now when we have instructions like this, the writes and reads don't interfere because we can do both in the same clock cycle. So let's see how this works with our example. So now we go into the fifth cycle, and now we have one instruction that wants to write to the register file and another one that wants to read, but it's okay. The first one writes in the first half of the clock cycle, and the second one reads in the second half of the clock cycle, and they don't interfere with each other. Now we can run the rest of the pipeline, and what we see is this happens every cycle. So in the next cycle, we have another two instructions that want to read and write at the same time, but because we've double pumped the register file, this isn't a problem. So what did we end up doing for this case? We needed to read and write the register file at the same time from different instructions. And the reason for this was that when we were pipelining, we had multiple instructions running at the same time. To fix this, we could have avoided bad combinations of instructions. That would have been impractical. It would have made it hard to write programs. We could have put in delays, but we saw we'd have to put in a lot of delays and that would hurt performance, or we could fix the register file to let us do reads and writes at the same time. So that's what we did. We changed the register file to allow writes in the first half clock cycle and reads on the second half of the clock cycle. So this solved our problem, and this took care of the hazard we had with the register file. But of course there are other hazards, and we're going to look at them in the rest of this lecture. So question, why do we have this hazard in the register file? What is it that's causing this hazard with the register file and the pipeline data path? Well, the reason we have this is because we're accessing the register file in both the write-back and the instruction decode stages. Our pipeline is executing instructions in parallel, so different instructions need to access the register file at the same time from different stages. And as we saw in MIPS, this is the write-back stage and the instruction decode stage that write and read from the register file. So why does double pumping the register file fix this hazard? Well, the answer is it allows us to read and write in the same cycle. And this is the problem we have. We have an earlier instruction that's at a later point in the pipeline that wants to write while our current instruction wants to read. And they do this in the same clock cycle. And so by double pumping, we can do both the write and the read in the same clock cycle.